I'm Audrey Mitchell, 28. And last year, my grandmother Catherine left me her $50 million hotel empire, 12 luxury properties she built from nothing. Then my mother's new husband, Richard, swooped in, convinced me to sign over temporary control, and systematically locked me out of my own inheritance. I was devastated, hopeless, ready to give up, until I received that mysterious email. Turns out, my grandmother wasn't actually dead. She had faked her own death to expose Richard's true intentions. Before I dive into this wild journey, drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. Hit that like button and subscribe if you've ever dealt with family betrayal. Trust me, this story has more twists than the luxury sheets at our flagship hotel. My relationship with Grandma Catherine defined my childhood. While other kids spent weekends at the mall, I was learning hospitality at the Grand Mitchell Hotel in Boston. I'd trail behind her in my little blazer as she inspected rooms, greeted guests, and managed staff with a perfect balance of authority and warmth. The secret to success isn't just providing luxury, Audrey, she would tell me. It's creating an experience so personal that guests feel like they've come home to a place they've never been before. Catherine Mitchell wasn't born into wealth. She started with a small, struggling 15-room motor lodge in 1972 that she purchased with her life savings after my grandfather died unexpectedly. Everyone told her a young widow with a small child had no business running a hotel. She proved them wrong. Over the next 5 decades, she transformed that one struggling property into the Mitchell Hotel Group, 12 luxury boutique hotels across the country, each with a distinct personality but the same impeccable standards. The flagship Grand Mitchell in Boston was her crown jewel, a historic building she'd rescued from demolition and transformed into a 5-star destination. My father, Catherine's only son, had been groomed to take over the business. He married my mother Diane when they were both 22, and I came along 2 years later. Dad worked alongside Grandma Catherine, learning every aspect of the business. My mother, though never as passionate about hotels, handled the marketing and public relations side. Everything changed when I was 12. My father was killed in a car accident, and our family fractured in ways I couldn't understand at the time. My mother retreated into grief, gradually stepping away from her role in the business. Catherine stepped up, not just running the hotels, but making sure I never felt the absence of my father's guidance. "You have his eye for detail and his generous heart," she would tell me. "But you have something he didn't, a fighter's spirit. That comes from me." By 16, I was working summer jobs in different departments of the hotels. By 20, I was sitting in on board meetings while completing my business degree. Catherine made no secret that she was grooming me to take her place eventually, and I embraced the responsibility. The hotels weren't just buildings or businesses to me. They were my father's legacy, my grandmother's achievement, and my future. Then Richard Blackwell entered our lives. I was 22 and in my final year of college when my mother started dating again. Richard was charming, successful, or so he claimed, and seemed to make my mother happy after years of sadness. But something about him set off alarm bells I couldn't quite articulate. "He asks too many questions about the business," I told Catherine after my first meeting with him. "And did you notice how he changed the subject whenever I asked about his investment company?" Catherine nodded, her eyes sharp. "I noticed. Keep your observations coming, Audrey. Your instincts are usually right." Over the next few years, Richard became a fixture in our lives. He married my mother after an 8-month whirlwind romance. I tried to be supportive for her sake, but the tension between Richard and me was palpable. He would make subtle comments undermining my knowledge of the business or questioning my experience, always with a smile that never reached his eyes. Then came the news that shattered our world. During a family dinner at the Grand Mitchell, Catherine announced she had been diagnosed with an aggressive form of cancer. The doctors gave her 6 months at most. "I've put everything in order," she told us, reaching for my hand across the table. "The Mitchell legacy will continue exactly as it should." Richard's eyes flickered with something I couldn't identify then but now recognize as calculation. As we left the restaurant that night, I caught him making a phone call, his voice low and excited. "Things are moving faster than we expected. It's happening." At the time, I thought he was sharing the bad news with a friend. I had no idea he was setting a plan in motion that would nearly destroy everything my grandmother had built. Catherine's decline was shockingly swift. Within 3 months of her diagnosis, we received the call that she had passed away peacefully in her sleep. The grief hit me like a physical blow. I had lost not only my grandmother but my mentor, my role model, and my strongest supporter. The funeral was held in the garden of the Grand Mitchell Hotel. Hundreds came to pay their respects: hotel staff, business associates, competitors who respected her, and countless guests who had experienced her legendary hospitality over the years. I stood numb beside my mother, barely registering the condolences or the speeches celebrating Catherine's remarkable life. 3 days after the funeral, we gathered in Bradford Stevens' office for the reading of the will. Bradford had been Catherine's attorney and friend for over 30 years, a distinguished man with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. As he read through the document, I tried to focus through my grief. To my granddaughter, Audrey Elizabeth Mitchell, I leave the entirety of my hotel holdings, including all 12 properties of the Mitchell Hotel Group, all associated assets, and voting control of Mitchell Enterprises. I looked up in shock as Bradford continued reading. Catherine had left me everything: the hotels, the holding company, even her personal properties. To my mother, she had left a generous cash inheritance and her art collection, but no stake in the business. I glanced at my mother, expecting to see hurt or surprise on her face. Instead, her expression was unreadable, her eyes fixed on Richard, who squeezed her hand with a tight smile. "There must be some mistake," Richard said smoothly when Bradford finished. "Audrey is only 26. She can't possibly manage an empire of this size." "Catherine was very clear about her wishes," Bradford replied, his tone neutral but firm. "Audrey has been training for this role for years." "Training is one thing. Actual experience is another," Richard countered. "Diane, tell him this is absurd." My mother finally spoke, her voice distant. Catherine always did have unrealistic expectations. The words stung more than I could have anticipated. In that moment, I realized I was truly alone. My father gone, my grandmother gone, and my mother apparently resentful of the trust Catherine had placed in me. Over the next week, Richard launched what I now recognize as a carefully orchestrated campaign. He expressed concern about my taking on too much responsibility too soon. He pointed out how grief could cloud judgment. He reminded everyone of my age and limited experience at every opportunity. "I'm just thinking of what's best for the family," he would say, always playing the concerned stepfather, "and for the business Catherine built. We all want to protect her legacy." Bradford arranged a meeting of the hotel group's board of directors to formalize my new position as CEO. The night before, Richard and my mother came to my apartment. "We've been talking with some of the board members," Richard said. "There are concerns about such a sudden transition." "What kind of concerns?" I asked, immediately on guard. "Experience, connections, financial acumen," my mother listed. "Darling, they're the same concerns I have. You're not ready for this." "Catherine thought I was," I countered. Richard leaned forward, his voice softening. "Catherine was ill, Audrey. Her judgment was impaired. She wasn't thinking clearly about what this would do to you." "What it would do to me," I repeated. "The pressure," my mother explained. "The scrutiny. The responsibility for hundreds of employees. I don't want to see you crushed by this." Richard presented what he called a compromise. He would step in as interim CEO for 1 year, with me as deputy to learn the ropes. After the year, if the board was satisfied with my progress, control would transfer to me. "It's temporary," Richard assured me, "just to make the transition smoother. Your grandmother would have wanted a safety net for you." Against my better judgment and the nagging voice in my head that sounded remarkably like Catherine, I signed the papers Bradford reluctantly prepared. I told myself it was a reasonable compromise. I told myself it was what my mother needed to feel secure. I told myself I was being mature and pragmatic. What I didn't tell myself, what I didn't allow myself to consider, was that I had just made the biggest mistake of my life. The moment the ink dried on those documents, everything changed. Richard's concerned stepfather act vanished. replaced by a steely efficiency I hadn't glimpsed before. Within days, he had moved his office into Catherine's former space at company headquarters. Within weeks, he had rearranged the executive team, sidelining those who had been most loyal to Catherine. "It's just a reorganization," he explained when I questioned him. "Every new leader puts their own team in place." But as I walked out of his office, my grandmother's office, I felt a chill of realization. This wasn't temporary. Richard had no intention of ever giving up control. 3 months after signing those temporary papers, I had been systematically pushed to the margins of my own inheritance. My title of Deputy CEO existed only on business cards I never had the opportunity to use. My security clearance had been quietly downgraded, limiting my access to certain floors and files. My email inquiries to department heads went unanswered or were redirected to Richard's new executive assistant, a cold-eyed woman named Veronica who had appeared from nowhere. The most painful changes were happening to the hotels themselves. The Grand Mitchell, once Catherine's pride and joy with its perfect blend of historic charm and modern luxury, was undergoing what Richard called necessary updates. The long-serving staff who had known me since childhood were being replaced by a rotating cast of temporary workers. The warm personal touches that had defined the Mitchell experience were giving way to generic, corporate efficiency. "We're streamlining operations," Richard explained during one of our increasingly rare meetings. "The old way of doing things was charming but inefficient. The old way is what made us special," I argued. "It's why guests choose us over larger chains." Richard waved away my concerns. "The market is changing. We need to adapt." It was during this meeting that I first heard the name Victor Hastings. Richard mentioned him casually as a business associate who was consulting on the restructuring. Something about the way he said the name, with a strange mix of deference and conspiracy, raised my suspicions immediately. That evening, I tried to access the financial records I should have had complete access to, only to find my authorization had been revoked. When I called IT support, they informed me that the request had come directly from the CEO's office. The next morning, I confronted my mother at her home. The home I had grown up in but now felt unwelcome in. "Richard is cutting me out completely," I told her. "He's changing everything Grandma built." My mother sipped her tea calmly. "He's modernizing. Change is hard, Audrey, but necessary. He's locked me out of the financial systems. How am I supposed to learn if I can't even see what's happening? He mentioned you've been asking a lot of questions, creating tension with the new team." She set down her cup with a sigh. "Maybe if you were more supportive of his vision." "His vision? These are my hotels." "They're family hotels," she corrected sharply. "And Richard is family now. You need to accept that." I left feeling like I was drowning. My mother had always been somewhat distant, especially after my father died, but I had never felt her actively working against me before. It was as if Richard had cast some kind of spell over her, turning her into someone I barely recognized. Desperate for allies, I reached out to James Parker, the longtime manager of our Chicago property. James had started as a bellhop 20 years ago and had been personally mentored by Catherine. If anyone would still be loyal to the Mitchell way, it would be him. We met discreetly at a coffee shop several blocks from the hotel. James looked nervous, constantly checking over his shoulder as we talked. "Things are bad, Audrey," he admitted in a low voice. "Really bad. They're cutting corners everywhere. Staff training, maintenance, even security. The quality is suffering, but they're pushing through rate increases anyway." "Who is Victor Hastings?" I asked. "Richard keeps mentioning him." James' face darkened. "Bad news. He's got some kind of investment firm that specializes in what they call hospitality consolidation. Basically, they buy up family-owned hotel groups, strip them down, and flip them to international chains." My stomach dropped. "You think that's Richard's plan? To sell the hotels?" "I don't know for sure," James admitted. "But yesterday they had assessors through the property, documenting everything. Said it was for insurance purposes, but they were asking questions about occupancy rates and market position. James promised to keep me informed of any developments. Before we parted, he slipped me a USB drive. Financial reports from the last 3 months, he explained. I risked my job getting these. Be careful who sees them. 2 weeks later, I attended my first board meeting since the transition. I had spent days analyzing the financial data James had given me and preparing a presentation on the concerning trends I'd discovered. Revenue was down at most properties despite increased rates. Staff turnover had tripled. Guest satisfaction scores were plummeting. When I tried to raise these issues, Richard cut me off immediately. "I think Audrey is still struggling to understand modern hotel economics," he told the board with a patronizing smile. "The fluctuations she's concerned about are simply part of our strategic repositioning." When I persisted, trying to show the actual numbers, Richard's tone hardened. "Perhaps this is why Catherine's decision raised so many eyebrows," he said. "Audrey simply doesn't have the background to interpret complex financial data. She sees a standard seasonal adjustment and panics about the sky falling." The board members shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. Most were new appointments, Richard's people. The few remaining from Catherine's time averted their eyes when I tried to make contact. "I think we all appreciate Audrey's enthusiasm," Richard continued, "but her constant questioning undermines our team's morale and distracts from the real work at hand. Perhaps she would benefit from some time away to process her grief properly." My mother, who rarely attended board meetings but was there that day, nodded in agreement. "Richard's right, dear. You've been under so much stress. Maybe a break would help." I left that meeting humiliated and furious. Richard had effectively labeled me as emotionally unstable and professionally incompetent in front of the entire board. Worse, my own mother had sided with him against me. For the first time, I began to wonder if fighting for my inheritance was even possible. Richard had orchestrated a complete takeover in just 3 months. What would be left of Catherine's legacy? Of my legacy? In another 3? 6 months after Catherine's death, the Mitchell Hotel Group was nearly unrecognizable. The distinctive touches that had made each property unique were being systematically erased, replaced by a generic corporate blandness that could have belonged to any mid-tier chain. Loyal guests were taking their business elsewhere. Online reviews were filled with phrases like "not what it used to be" and "lost its charm." James Parker had been keeping me informed of changes at the Chicago property, but his updates had suddenly stopped 2 weeks earlier. When I called the hotel, I was told he no longer worked for the company. Desperate for information, I reached out to his personal cell phone. "They fired me with no notice," James told me, his voice tight with anger. "Said it was for sharing confidential information. Someone must have seen us meeting." Before hanging up, he gave me one final piece of information. "They're meeting tomorrow night at the Grand Mitchell. Private dining room. Richard, Victor Hastings, and some suits from the Lux International Group. Whatever they're planning, it's happening soon." The Lux International Group was one of the largest hotel conglomerates in the world, known for acquiring smaller chains and absorbing them into their standardized brand. If they were meeting with Richard, it could only mean one thing. He was planning to sell. I needed proof. Using my old key card, which still worked for some areas of the hotel despite the security downgrades, I slipped into the administrative offices after hours. Most of the files I needed would be digital and inaccessible to me, but I knew Catherine had always kept hard copies of important documents in her private office. Richard had redecorated, removing all traces of my grandmother, but the hidden wall safe remained behind a generic landscape painting. Catherine had shown me the combination years ago, my father's birthday, followed by hers. Inside were various legal documents, most of which I didn't have time to examine closely. But one folder labeled Project Phoenix caught my eye. Inside was a detailed proposal for the strategic dismantling and sale of Mitchell Hotel assets to maximize shareholder value. The document outlined a 3-phase plan. First, cut costs to improve short-term profitability figures. Second, eliminate long-term staff with institutional knowledge who might resist changes. Third, sell off the properties individually to various buyers, with the Lux Group taking the 4 most profitable locations. At the bottom of the proposal was a handwritten note in what I recognized as Richard's writing. "VH confirms we can clear $65 million after all transactions, split as discussed." My hands shook as I took photos of the documents with my phone. Richard wasn't just selling my inheritance. He was planning to pocket the proceeds with this Victor Hastings person. As I was replacing the documents, I heard voices approaching. Quickly closing the safe and returning the painting to its position, I slipped behind the heavy curtains just as the door opened. "The board won't be a problem," Richard was saying. "Most of them are already on board. The few holdouts will fall in line when they see the payout." "What about the girl?" a voice I didn't recognize asked. "She legally owns the shares." "Audrey?" Richard laughed. "She signed over voting control. And Diane has convinced her that taking a sabbatical would be good for her mental health. By the time she figures out what's happening, it'll be too late." "And Diane is completely on board?" the stranger asked. "She'll do whatever I tell her," Richard said confidently. "She has no idea what the hotels are actually worth. She thinks we're just restructuring to improve profitability." The two men left, still talking, and I waited several minutes before emerging from my hiding place. My mind was racing. I had the proof I needed, but what could I do with it? Richard had the board, the executive team, and even my own mother in his corner. I decided to confront my mother directly with the evidence. That evening, I went to her house, determined to make her see the truth about her husband. "Mom, you need to see this," I said, showing her the photos I had taken. "Richard is planning to sell everything. Everything Dad and Grandma built. Everything that's supposed to be our family legacy." My mother barely glanced at the phone. Richard explained, "You might try something like this." He said, "Your obsession with controlling the hotels has become unhealthy." "Obsession? Mom, these are our hotels. My inheritance that he's stealing." "He's not stealing anything," she said calmly. "He's making necessary business decisions that you're too emotionally attached to understand." "Did you see the note?" I demanded. "About him clearing $65 million? Does that sound like a necessary business decision or like theft?" "That's enough, Audrey," my mother said sharply. "Richard warned me you were fabricating evidence. I didn't want to believe him, but this is exactly what he described." I stared at her in disbelief. "You think I'm making this up?" "Why would I do that?" "Because you can't accept that Catherine made a mistake leaving everything to you," she said, her voice suddenly bitter. "She always favored you, always acted like you were the only one who could possibly understand her precious hotels. She cut me out completely after I gave 20 years of my life to that business. Richard is just correcting that injustice." In that moment, I finally understood. This wasn't just about Richard's greed. My mother was jealous. Jealous of my relationship with Catherine. Jealous of my inheritance. She was allowing Richard to dismantle our family legacy out of spite. I left without another word, devastated by this final betrayal. That night, I received an email from Bradford Stevens' office. Richard had initiated legal proceedings to have me removed from the board of directors, citing erratic behavior and attempts to undermine company operations. The next morning, my bank called. There had been unusual activity on my accounts. Someone had initiated transfers of nearly all my funds to an offshore account. The bank had flagged it as potentially fraudulent and stopped the transactions. Then my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. "Miss Mitchell?" a woman's voice asked. "This is Detective Larson with the Financial Crimes Unit. We're investigating some serious allegations of embezzlement at the Mitchell Hotel Group. We need you to come in for questioning." Richard was framing me. He was moving faster than I had anticipated, working to discredit me legally and financially before I could expose his plans. With the board, the executive team, and even my mother against me, who would believe my version of events? For the first time since this nightmare began, I considered giving up. Maybe I should just walk away, take whatever settlement Richard might offer, and start over somewhere else. The fight seemed impossible to win. That night, alone in my apartment, I pulled out the last bottle of Catherine's favorite whiskey that we had shared before her diagnosis. As I poured a glass in her memory, my phone pinged with an email notification. The sender was unknown. The subject line simply, "Grand Mitchell Hotel, Room 1237. Tomorrow, 10 a.m. Come alone." Room 1237 at the Grand Mitchell Hotel had special significance. It wasn't actually a guest room, but a small, private meeting room that Catherine had used for her most confidential business discussions. Few people knew of its existence, as it was accessed through what appeared to be a storage closet off a side corridor. Despite my suspicions that this might be another of Richard's traps, I found myself drawn to the meeting. Who else would know about room 1237? And why the secrecy? I arrived early, using service corridors to avoid being seen by hotel staff who might report my presence to Richard. The room was exactly as I remembered it. A small, elegant space with a round table, comfortable chairs, and no windows. Catherine had called it her war room. At precisely 10 a.m., the door opened, and Bradford Stevens entered. The attorney looked more tired than I remembered, with new lines etched around his eyes. "Thank you for coming, Audrey," he said, setting down his briefcase. "I apologize for the cloak and dagger approach, but it was necessary." "Necessary? Why?" I asked. "What's this about?" Bradford hesitated, then moved to the door. "There's someone who needs to speak with you." He opened the door, and I felt the blood drain from my face. Standing before me, very much alive, was my grandmother, Audrey Mitchell. "Hello, Audrey," she said, her voice exactly as I remembered. "I believe we have quite a lot to discuss." For several seconds, I couldn't move, couldn't speak. Catherine looked thinner than I remembered, her always elegant clothing hanging somewhat loosely on her frame. But her eyes were clear and sharp as ever. "This isn't possible," I finally managed. "I was at your funeral." "You were at a funeral," Catherine corrected, taking a seat at the table. "Not mine." As I sank into a chair, Bradford explained the elaborate deception. Catherine had indeed been diagnosed with cancer, but during treatment, her doctors discovered the diagnosis was incorrect. She had a rare but treatable condition that mimicked cancer symptoms. By the time we got the correct diagnosis, I had already set certain plans in motion, Catherine explained. And then I saw an opportunity. "An opportunity?" I repeated, still struggling to process her presence. "To test Richard," she said simply. "I never trusted him, Audrey. From the moment your mother brought him home, something felt wrong. But Diane was happier than she'd been in years, and I had no proof of anything concrete." "So you faked your death?" I asked incredulously. "I needed to see what he would do if he thought I was out of the picture," Catherine said. "How far he would go, how quickly he would show his true colors. But the body at the funeral..." Bradford cleared his throat. "A closed casket service for a very good reason. There was no body. The death certificate, the will reading. All part of the illusion," Catherine confirmed. "Bradford helped arrange everything. Only he and my doctor know the truth." I sat back, anger beginning to replace shock. "You let me think you were dead. You watched while Richard tore apart everything you built. Everything you said would be my legacy. You did nothing while he turned my mother against me and systematically destroyed my life." Catherine's expression softened slightly. "It wasn't easy to stay hidden, believe me. But I needed indisputable evidence of what Richard really was. And I needed to see something else, too." "What?" I demanded. "Whether you had what it takes to fight for what's yours," she said bluntly. "Running a business like ours isn't just about hospitality and spreadsheets, Audrey. It's about backbone. About standing your ground when everything is falling apart around you. So this was some kind of sick test?" My voice rose. "You put me through hell to see if I was tough enough?" "I put you through a controlled crisis," Catherine corrected. "The real world will throw much worse at you, believe me. I needed to know you wouldn't break." "I almost did break," I admitted, tears of anger and relief mingling. "Just yesterday, I was ready to give up." "But you didn't," Catherine pointed out. "You kept fighting. You found the evidence in the safe." "Yes, I know about that. I've had people watching you, reporting back. You've shown more resilience than even I expected." As my anger subsided, practical questions began to emerge. "What happens now?" "Richard has control of everything. He's planning to sell the hotels to Lux International." "Not for long," Catherine said, a familiar steely glint entering her eye. "Bradford has been building a case. We have documentation of everything Richard has done. The financial manipulation, the fraudulent board appointments, everything. Your mother is a more complicated matter," Bradford added gently. "She hasn't broken any laws, but she has been willfully blind to Richard's actions." "She's jealous," I said quietly. "Of what you left to me. Of our relationship." Catherine sighed. "Diane and I have had our differences over the years. After your father died, she pulled away from both the business and from me. I should have tried harder to bridge that gap. For the next hour, Catherine, Bradford, and I outlined a plan to reclaim control of the Mitchell Hotel Group. Bradford had already been working with financial investigator Samantha Wells, who had been tracking the money movements Richard had been orchestrating. He's been siphoning funds to offshore accounts for months, Samantha explained when she joined our meeting. Classic preparation for a disappearing act once the sales go through. Despite the solid plan taking shape, I still felt a lingering anger toward my grandmother. As the meeting concluded, I held back while Bradford and Samantha left to make some calls. "I understand why you're angry," Catherine said when we were alone. "In your position, I would be furious. It just feels like you didn't trust me enough to include me in your plan from the beginning," I admitted. Catherine reached across the table and took my hand. "This wasn't about trust, Audrey. This was about preparation. The hotel business seems glamorous from the outside, but at its heart, it's a battlefield. Competitors trying to steal your staff, partners trying to renegotiate terms, investors trying to influence your vision. I needed to know you could hold your ground when everything was at stake. And if I had failed your test?" I asked. "If I had given up? Then I would have known you needed more time before taking control," she said simply. "But you didn't fail. You've proven you're ready, not just to run the hotels, but to fight for them." As much as I wanted to hold on to my anger, I could see the logic in Catherine's methods. Harsh as they were, they had revealed both Richard's true nature and my own determination. "So what's our next move?" I asked. Catherine's smile was wolfish. "Now? We go to war." The next 2 weeks were a whirlwind of covert operations. Catherine remained dead to the world, directing our counterattack from a suite she had rented under an assumed name at a competitor's hotel. Bradford coordinated our legal strategy, while Samantha Wells continued tracking the financial trails Richard was creating. James Parker, who I had contacted and brought into our confidence, became our eyes and ears within the company. After being fired from the Chicago hotel, he had been quickly hired at the Boston property by the food and beverage director, an old friend who didn't know about his termination and who Richard hadn't yet replaced with one of his people. "They're accelerating the timeline," James reported during one of our strategy sessions. "Lux International representatives have been touring all the properties. They're calling it a partnership exploration. But the staff is already being measured for Lux uniforms." "What about the board?" Catherine asked. "How many are still loyal to Richard?" "Most of them," James admitted. "But I've identified 2 who seem uncomfortable with the direction things are going: Martha Winters and Paul Chen. They were asking questions about why certain financial reports haven't been distributed." Catherine nodded. "Bradford, reach out to them discreetly. Don't reveal that I'm alive, but sound them out about their concerns." While Bradford worked the legal and corporate angles, I took on a more direct approach. Disguised with a wig and glasses, a precaution that felt melodramatic but necessary given Richard's surveillance of me, I began following him to document his meetings with Victor Hastings and the Lux International executives. Using a long-range camera lens borrowed from a photographer friend, I captured images of Richard exchanging documents in a park with Victor, entering the offices of Lux International, and meeting with unfamiliar men at restaurants away from the hotels. One particularly valuable piece of evidence came from Richard's own carelessness. While photographing a meeting between Richard and Victor at an outdoor cafe, I managed to capture clear images of the documents they were reviewing, detailed plans for stripping assets from the hotels before the sales were finalized, including the removal of antique furniture and art that had been part of the Mitchell brand identity for decades. Samantha Wells provided the financial smoking gun we needed. "I've traced the money," she told us, spreading documents across the table in Catherine's suite. "Richard has set up a complex network of shell companies, but the end destination is clear: a private account in the Cayman Islands, jointly held by Richard Blackwell and Victor Hastings." "How much have they diverted so far?" Catherine asked. "Nearly 12 million, Samantha replied, mostly from operational accounts, disguised as consulting fees to non-existent firms. But that's just the warm-up. Based on the transfer schedules I've uncovered, they're planning to move another 50 million as soon as the sales are finalized." Bradford Stevens brought his own breakthrough. "Martha Winters has agreed to meet with me," he reported. "She's had concerns for months but was afraid to speak up. Richard apparently threatened to reveal some indiscretion from her past if she didn't support his initiatives. Blackmail, Catherine said grimly. Add that to the list of charges. As our case against Richard built, he began to grow suspicious of my renewed confidence. During a rare encounter at the company offices, where I still maintained nominal access, he cornered me in a hallway. "You've been unusually quiet lately," he observed, his tone casual but his eyes cold. Accepting reality at last? Just focusing on my future, I replied with a manufactured smile. "You were right. Maybe the hotel business isn't for me after all." Richard studied my face, clearly not believing my sudden surrender. Interesting timing. Just when we're exploring some exciting new directions for the company, I heard the Lux International Partnership. I kept my voice neutral. Sounds like a smart move. It is, Richard agreed, still watching me closely. Very smart for everyone involved. I'm sure it is, I said. Well, I should get going. Lots of new opportunities to explore. As I turned to leave, Richard called after me, "Audrey? If you're planning anything foolish, remember that your mother's well-being is tied to mine now. She's fragile. A scandal would devastate her." The threat was clear. If I moved against him, he would make my mother suffer for it. That evening, I reported the encounter to Catherine. "He's using Mom as leverage," I said. "And he's right, she is fragile. She's been dependent on him emotionally since they married." Catherine's expression hardened. "Richard underestimates Diane. She may have been blinded by him, but she's not weak. She's a Mitchell. She doesn't feel like a Mitchell anymore," I pointed out. "She resents both of us." "That's my fault as much as anyone's," Catherine admitted. "I pushed her away after your father died. I was less than understanding about her grief." This was a side of Catherine I'd rarely seen, regretful, acknowledging her own mistakes. It softened some of my lingering anger toward her. "We need to bring her into this," I said suddenly. "Mom deserves to know the truth. About you. About Richard. All of it." Catherine hesitated. "It's risky. If she tips off Richard—" "She won't," I said with more confidence than I felt. "Not once she sees the evidence." The next day brought an unexpected crisis. One of Richard's board allies, tipped off by Martha Winter's sudden reluctance to support the Lux deal, had hired a private investigator to follow Bradford. The investigator had photographed Bradford entering Catherine's hotel. Richard moved quickly, filing an emergency petition to have me removed from any position of authority within the company and to have a conservator appointed to manage my affairs. The grounds? Delusional behavior, including claims that her deceased grandmother is still alive and conspiring with her. The petition included affidavits from 2 psychiatrists who had never met me, claiming that grief had triggered a psychotic break. Richard had also convinced my mother to support the petition, describing it as the only way to get Audrey the help she needs. Bradford called an emergency meeting in Catherine's suite. "They're moving to have a hearing tomorrow morning," he explained. "Judge Wilson is presiding. He's known for fast rulings on conservatorship cases." "Can they really do this?" I asked, panic rising. "Just declare me incompetent without even examining me?" "Normally no," Bradford said grimly. "But Richard has influence with Judge Wilson. They belong to the same exclusive club. And with your mother supporting the petition, we need to move up our timeline," Catherine decided. "Bradford, how quickly can you file our counterclaims?" "First thing tomorrow," he said. "But Richard will likely have a temporary conservatorship in place before our claims can be heard." "Then we need to go public tonight," I said. "Before the hearing." Catherine shook her head. "Not yet. We need one more piece of evidence. Something so damning that even Richard can't talk his way out of it." James Parker provided that final piece within hours. "Richard is meeting Victor and the Lux executives tonight at the Grand Mitchell," he reported. "Private dining room. They're finalizing the sale terms." "Can you get us access to record the meeting?" Catherine asked. James nodded. "The service passage behind the private dining room. There's a vent that carries sound perfectly. It's why Catherine never used that room for truly confidential discussions." "I'll do it," I volunteered. "I know every inch of that hotel. I can get in and out without being seen." Catherine looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Pride mixed with worry. "It's dangerous. If Richard catches you—" "He won't," I assured her. This is my hotel. I know it better than he ever will. That night, dressed in a housekeeper's uniform provided by James, I slipped into the Grand Mitchell through a service entrance. Using back corridors and service elevators, I made my way to the passage behind the private dining room. The vent James had mentioned was small but perfect for capturing sound. I set up the recording device Samantha had provided and settled in to wait. Richard arrived first. Then Victor Hastings, a sleek, silver-haired man I recognized from my surveillance photos. 3 Lux International executives followed, along with 2 of Richard's board allies. For the next hour, I listened as they laid out their entire plan in damning detail. The hotels would be sold for far below market value to Lux, with Richard and Victor receiving massive consulting fees through their shell companies. The Mitchell name would be erased completely, the staff terminated with minimal severance, and the distinctive character of each property homogenized into the Lux brand. "What about the girl?" one of the Lux executives asked. "Even with a conservator, she's still the legal owner. By tomorrow afternoon, she'll be in a private facility for evaluation," Richard explained calmly. "The conservator, a colleague of mine, will have full authority to execute the sales. By the time she's released, it will be a done deal." "And there's no chance of the grandmother's will being contested?" another executive asked. Richard laughed. "Catherine Mitchell is dead and buried. There's no one left who can challenge us." The irony of his confidence made me smile despite the seriousness of the situation. As the meeting concluded with handshakes and congratulations, I carefully retrieved the recording device and made my way out of the hotel the same way I had entered. Back in Catherine's suite, we listened to the recording together. Even Catherine, who had suspected the worst of Richard from the beginning, looked shocked at the coldness with which he discussed having me institutionalized. "This is it," Bradford said. "The evidence we needed. Combined with the financial documentation and the other evidence we've gathered, it's more than enough to stop Richard." "Not just stop him," Catherine corrected. "Destroy him." As we finalized our plans for the next day, I received a text from an unknown number. "Something's wrong with your mother." Richard stormed home, packed a bag, told her to be ready to leave the country tomorrow. "She's frightened." Grand Mitchell, room 712. "It could be a trap," Bradford warned. "Or Richard could be planning to use Mom as a hostage or leverage," I countered. "I have to go." Catherine studied me for a moment, then nodded. "Go. But be careful. And take this." She handed me a small object that looked like a lipstick case. "Panic button. Press it if you're in trouble, and the hotel security team, the ones still loyal to me, will come running." I slipped the device into my pocket and headed back to the Grand Mitchell for the second time that night, unaware that I was walking into Richard's last desperate gambit. Room 712 was in the west wing of the Grand Mitchell, a standard luxury room rather than one of the signature suites. The location struck me as odd. If my mother was truly there, why not in the presidential suite that Richard typically used for their stays? Caution made me pause before knocking. I sent a text to James Parker. "Any record of my mother checking into room 712 today?" His response came quickly. "No reservation under Blackwell or Mitchell for that room. Currently listed as vacant." Definitely a trap. I was about to retreat when the elevator down the hall chimed and the doors opened. My mother stepped out, looking disoriented and clutching her purse tightly. When she saw me, her eyes widened. "Audrey, what are you doing here?" She looked around nervously. Richard told me to meet him in room 712. So she was expected but hadn't checked in yet, which meant Richard was probably waiting inside. "Mom, don't go in there," I said, keeping my voice low. "Richard is setting you up." She frowned. "What are you talking about?" Richard said, "We need to discuss some important business matter." "At midnight? In a hotel room listed as vacant?" I took her arm gently. "Mom, there's so much you don't know. Richard has been lying to you, to all of us." "You're the one who's been acting strangely," she countered, but with less conviction than before. "Richard said you've been making wild accusations, that you need help. Mom, please, just listen to me for 5 minutes. Not here, somewhere safe." I glanced at the room door, half expecting it to open at any moment. "If you still want to meet Richard after that, I won't stop you." Something in my tone must have reached her. After a moment's hesitation, she nodded. 5 minutes. I led her to the service stairs, safer than the elevator where we might be seen on security cameras. We descended to the mezzanine level where there was a small library room that was typically unoccupied at this hour. Richard is planning to sell the hotels, I said once we were alone. He's been embezzling funds, manipulating the board, and now he's arranged to have me declared mentally incompetent so I can't stop him. My mother's face paled. That's absurd. He would never. I pulled out my phone and played a short clip from the recording I'd made earlier that evening. Richard's voice was unmistakable. By tomorrow afternoon, she'll be in a private facility for evaluation. The conservator will have full authority to execute the sales. This could be taken out of context, my mother said. But doubt had crept into her voice. Mom, there's more. I hesitated, knowing the next revelation would be the hardest for her to accept. Grandma Catherine is alive. Her head snapped up. What? She faked her death to expose Richard's true intentions. She suspected from the beginning that he was after the hotels. That's impossible, my mother whispered. I was at her funeral. A closed casket service with no body, I explained. It was all carefully planned. Bradford Stevens helped arrange everything. My mother stood abruptly, anger replacing shock. This is exactly what Richard warned me about. You've created this elaborate fantasy because you can't accept that Catherine left you with a responsibility you can't handle. It's not a fantasy, Mom, I can prove it. Catherine is staying at the Westbrook Hotel under the name Elizabeth Danning. Come with me, and you can see for yourself. She hesitated, and for a moment, I thought she might agree. Then her expression hardened. Richard was right. You need help, Audrey. Mom, please. No. She held up a hand. I've listened to your 5 minutes of delusions. Now I'm going to meet my husband as planned. As she turned to leave, I made a desperate move. He's planning to leave the country tomorrow, with all the money he's stolen from us. Is he taking you with him? That stopped her. What are you talking about? The text I received. It said Richard came home, packed a bag, and told you to be ready to leave the country tomorrow. Confusion crossed her face. Richard hasn't been home all day, and nobody said anything about leaving the country. Now it was my turn to be confused. Then, who sent? The realization hit us both at the same time. The text had been a lure. Not for me, as I'd initially suspected, but for my mother. We need to go, I said urgently, taking her arm. Now. We had just reached the door when it opened from the outside. Richard stood there, flanked by 2 men in suits who were clearly not hotel staff. Diane, Richard said smoothly. I see you found Audrey. I've been worried about her. Richard, my mother said, her voice uncertain. What's going on? Audrey says. Audrey is very unwell, Richard interrupted, his voice gentle but firm. These gentlemen are from the Lakeside Wellness Center. They're here to help. One of the men stepped forward. Miss Mitchell, I'm Dr. Larson. We have an order signed by Judge Wilson authorizing us to take you to our facility for evaluation. That's impossible, I said. The hearing isn't until tomorrow. Emergency order, the man replied, producing a document. Signed an hour ago, based on evidence of immediate risk to yourself and others. Richard had moved faster than we'd anticipated, somehow getting the judge to sign off without waiting for the formal hearing. This is illegal, I insisted, backing away. My attorney has been dealt with, Richard said coldly, dropping the concerned act now that his plan was in motion. Bradford Stevens has been arrested for conspiracy to commit fraud. Something about helping a client fake her own death for insurance purposes. My blood ran cold. They'd gotten to Bradford, which meant Catherine might be in danger too. Diane, Richard continued, turning to my mother. I know this is difficult, but Audrey needs professional help. These delusions about Catherine being alive, about me stealing from the company, they've gotten worse. She was caught breaking into the hotel tonight, recording a private business meeting, trespassing. My mother looked between us, confusion and fear on her face. I don't understand. Why would Audrey make up these stories? Because she can't handle the truth, Richard said softly. That Catherine made a mistake leaving her the business. That she's not capable of running it. I could see my mother wavering, wanted to believe her husband but troubled by the inconsistencies. I had one last card to play. "Mom," I said quietly, "ask him about Victor Hastings. Ask him about the $50 million they're planning to pocket from selling our hotels." Richard's expression flickered, just briefly, but my mother caught it. "Richard?" she asked. "Who is Victor Hastings?" "A business associate," he said dismissively. "Audrey is twisting a legitimate business relationship into some conspiracy theory." "Then why are you planning to leave the country tomorrow?" she pressed, growing more confident. "Why did you pack a bag without telling me?" Richard's mask slipped further. "Who told you that? Is it true?" my mother demanded. "We need to go," Dr. Larson interrupted, nodding to his colleague. "Miss Mitchell, please come with us voluntarily. We don't want this to become difficult." As the men moved toward me, I backed against the wall, my hand slipping into my pocket to grasp Catherine's panic button. Before I could press it, my mother stepped between me and the men. "My daughter isn't going anywhere," she said, her voice suddenly strong and clear. "And neither is my husband, until he explains exactly what's going on." Richard's face darkened. "Diane, you don't understand what's at stake here." "Then explain it to me," she challenged. "Explain who Victor Hastings is. Explain why you never told me you were selling the hotels. Explain why you're sending our daughter to a mental facility in the middle of the night without even consulting me." For a moment, Richard seemed at a loss for words. Then his expression changed to something colder, more calculating than I'd ever seen. "You want the truth? Fine. The Mitchell Hotel Group is worth far more broken up than as a single entity. Catherine was a sentimental old fool who couldn't see that. I've arranged deals that will triple the value of your investment, our investment." "By stealing from us?" I interjected. "By being smarter than you?" Richard snapped. "Those hotels were wasting their potential with their quaint, outdated approach to hospitality. The Mitchell legacy? Worthless sentimentality." My mother's face had gone very still. "And Bradford Stevens? Is he really arrested?" Richard hesitated just long enough to confirm the lie. "He will be, once I make a call." "And Catherine?" my mother asked, her voice barely audible. "Is what Audrey said true? Is she alive?" Richard laughed harshly. "Don't be ridiculous. I identified her body myself. It was the wrong thing to say. My mother knew, as I did, that there had been no body to identify." "You're lying," she said flatly. "You've been lying all along." Richard's facade cracked completely. "Enough of this. Take her," he ordered the men. As they moved forward, I pressed Catherine's panic button. Instantly, the room's phone began to ring. Richard froze, confused by the interruption. "That would be hotel security," I explained calmly. "The real hotel security, not whatever rent-a-cops you've paid off." On cue, the door burst open, and 4 uniformed security officers entered, led by the longtime head of security, Frank Donovan, another Catherine loyalist who had somehow survived Richard's purges. "Miss Mitchell." Frank acknowledged me with a nod. "Is there a problem here?" "These men are attempting to remove me from the premises against my will," I explained. "Based on fraudulent documentation." Frank turned to Richard. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you and these gentlemen to come with me to the security office while we sort this out." "This is absurd," Richard sputtered. "I'm the CEO of this company." "Actually," said a new voice from the doorway. "You're not." Catherine Mitchell stood there, very much alive, with Samantha Wells and 2 police officers beside her. The color drained from Richard's face. "This isn't possible." "Yet here I am," Catherine replied coolly. "Officers, this is the man I mentioned. Richard Blackwell. The financial records Miss Wells provided should be sufficient for an arrest on charges of embezzlement, fraud, and conspiracy." As the police officers moved to handcuff a shell-shocked Richard, my mother stared at Catherine in disbelief. "You're really alive," she whispered. "I am," Catherine acknowledged. "And we have a great deal to discuss, Diane. About the past and about the future." As Richard was led away, still protesting that Catherine was an imposter, that we were all conspiring against him, I looked between my mother and grandmother, two strong women who had become strangers to each other over the years. Both of you do, I said firmly. But not tonight. Tonight, we need to make sure Richard can't cause any more damage. For the first time in years, perhaps ever, I saw my mother and grandmother exchange a look of complete agreement. Yes, they said in unison. We do. Richard's arrest was just the beginning. In the days that followed, we launched a carefully orchestrated campaign to regain control of the Mitchell Hotel Group and expose the full extent of Richard's schemes. The centerpiece of our strategy was an emergency board meeting called by Bradford Stevens, who had been released within hours of his arrest when the allegations against him proved baseless. The meeting was scheduled for 10 a.m. at the Grand Mitchell's main conference room, ostensibly to discuss recent developments in leadership. What the board members, most of them Richard's appointees, didn't know was that we had prepared a dramatic revelation that would shake the foundation of everything they thought they knew. I arrived early with Bradford, reviewing our strategy one final time. Are you sure about this approach? He asked. We could simply present the evidence without the theatrics. The theatrics are necessary, I insisted. These board members have been complicit in Richard's plans, whether knowingly or through willful ignorance. They need to understand the magnitude of their mistake. Bradford nodded, though he still looked uncomfortable with the plan. Catherine is ready? She's been ready for months, I assured him. As the board members filed in, I studied their faces. Some looked concerned, others annoyed at the last-minute meeting. Victor Hastings was notably absent. He had disappeared the night of Richard's arrest, presumably fleeing back to whatever tax haven he called home. My mother sat quietly in a corner, still processing the revelations of the past few days. She had spent hours talking with Catherine, working through decades of misunderstandings and resentments. Their relationship would never be simple, but they had found a fragile new understanding based on their shared anger at Richard's manipulation. At precisely 10 a.m., Bradford called the meeting to order. Thank you all for coming on such short notice. As you're aware, Richard Blackwell was arrested 3 days ago on serious charges related to financial improprieties within the company. Murmurs spread through the room. The arrest had been kept remarkably quiet, with only vague statements released to the press about Richard taking a leave of absence to address personal matters. In light of these developments, Bradford continued, we need to address the leadership of the Mitchell Hotel Group moving forward. Miss Audrey Mitchell, as the legal owner of the company's shares per Catherine Mitchell's will, would like to address the board. I stepped to the podium, surveying the faces before me. Good morning. The past few days have been tumultuous for all of us. Richard Blackwell's arrest has raised serious questions about the direction this company has been taking. One of Richard's closest allies on the board, Edward Simmons, interrupted. With all due respect, Miss Mitchell, while these allegations against Richard are concerning, they remain just that, allegations. And even if they prove true, this doesn't automatically qualify you to assume leadership of the company. I agree, I said, surprising him. My qualifications for leadership should be evaluated on their own merits. But before we discuss the future leadership of the Mitchell Hotel Group, there's something you should all know about its past leadership. I nodded to Bradford, who opened the conference room doors. Catherine Mitchell walked in, elegant as always in one of her trademark suits, looking every inch the formidable businesswoman who had built an empire from scratch. The reaction was immediate and dramatic. Board members gasped. One woman actually screamed, and Edward Simmons looked as though he might faint. Hello, Catherine said calmly. I believe you were discussing my company. For several seconds, stunned silence filled the room. Then everyone began speaking at once, demands for explanations, accusations of trickery, expressions of disbelief. Bradford called for order, his authoritative voice eventually cutting through the chaos. If you'll all please take your seats, everything will be explained. When relative calm had been restored, Catherine took the podium. Yes, I am alive. No, I did not fake my death for fraudulent purposes or financial gain. I temporarily removed myself from the picture to expose a conspiracy against this company, a conspiracy many of you unwittingly became part of. She proceeded to lay out the entire story, her suspicious of Richard from the beginning, the misdiagnosis that gave her an opportunity to test him, and the elaborate scheme she had created with Bradford's help. Over the past 6 months, Catherine continued, Richard Blackwell, in collaboration with Victor Hastings, has systematically looted this company, fired loyal employees, degraded our brand, and prepared to sell our properties at below market values for personal gain. Samantha Wells then presented the financial evidence, spreadsheets, bank transfers, offshore account details projected onto a large screen. The numbers were damning, showing millions diverted from company accounts through fake consulting firms. Next came the recording I had made of Richard's meeting with the Lux International executives, where he had explicitly outlined the plan to strip the hotels of assets before the sales. As the evidence mounted, the expressions of the board members shifted from shock to embarrassment to anger, directed not at us, but at themselves for being so thoroughly duped. Richard Blackwell convinced many of you that I was incompetent, emotionally unstable, even delusional, I said, taking the podium again. He used my age and my grief for a grandmother who wasn't actually dead, to undermine my authority and credibility. I looked directly at Edward Simmons. He convinced you that I wasn't qualified to lead this company. Perhaps I wasn't 6 months ago. But these past months have taught me more about business, loyalty, and leadership than any MBA program ever could. Catherine stepped forward to stand beside me. The Mitchell Hotel Group has always been a family business. My son, Audrey's father, would have led it if tragedy hadn't taken him too soon. I built this company to last generations, not to be carved up and sold off in pieces. So what happens now? Asked Martha Winters, one of the few board members who had begun to question Richard's plans. Now, Catherine said firmly, we rebuild. We restore what was damaged. We rehire those who were unfairly dismissed. And we continue the Mitchell legacy under the leadership it was always meant to have. She placed a hand on my shoulder. Audrey Mitchell will assume the position of CEO, effective immediately. I will serve as chairman of the board for a transition period, after which I will retire, for real this time. Edward Simmons stood up. While this is all quite dramatic, we still have a fiduciary responsibility to consider. Miss Mitchell's qualifications are not in question, my mother interrupted, speaking for the first time. I've watched my daughter fight tirelessly against overwhelming odds to save this company when everyone, including me, was against her. If that doesn't demonstrate leadership qualifications, I don't know what does. Her unexpected support brought tears to my eyes. Catherine looked equally surprised and moved. I propose we vote now, Bradford suggested. All in favor of appointing Audrey Mitchell as CEO of the Mitchell Hotel Group, effective immediately, with Catherine Mitchell serving as interim board chair? One by one, hands went up around the table, slowly at first, then with increasing confidence. Even Edward Simmons eventually raised his hand, albeit with obvious reluctance. Motion carries unanimously, Bradford announced. Congratulations, Miss Mitchell. As the board members filed out, still looking shell-shocked by the morning's revelations, I found myself alone with Catherine and my mother. 3 generations of Mitchell women, united for perhaps the first time. What about Richard? My mother asked quietly. What will happen to him? He's facing serious charges, Bradford explained, joining us. Embezzlement, fraud, conspiracy. The evidence is overwhelming. He'll likely make a plea deal to avoid a lengthy trial, but he's looking at significant prison time. My mother nodded, her expression unreadable. And the divorce? Already in process, Bradford assured her. Given the circumstances, it should be straightforward. Richard will have no claim on your assets. As Bradford left to make some calls, Catherine approached my mother cautiously. Diane, I know we have years of misunderstandings to work through, but I want you to know I've always valued your contribution to this family and this business. My mother's smile was sad but genuine. It's taken me too long to realize that I've been blaming you for things that weren't your fault. Richard exploited that divide between us. He exploited all our vulnerabilities, I said, but we're stronger for having survived it. For the first time in memory, the 3 of us embraced, a moment of unity that felt like both an ending and a beginning. In the days that followed, we moved quickly to undo the damage Richard had caused. James Parker was reinstated as manager of the Chicago property and promoted to regional operations director. The loyal staff members who had been terminated were offered their jobs back with back pay. The deals with Lux International were canceled, with Bradford negotiating minimal penalties for breach of contract. Victor Hastings remained at large, but Samantha Wells had provided enough evidence to international authorities that his accounts were frozen, trapping whatever funds he had managed to steal. 1 month after the board meeting, we held a grand reopening celebration at the flagship Audrey Mitchell Hotel. The event served multiple purposes: announcing Catherine's return to the land of the living, explained publicly as a private medical retreat following a misdiagnosis, introducing me as the new CEO, and signaling to the hospitality industry that the Mitchell Hotel Group was not only surviving but thriving. As I stood at the podium addressing investors, employees, and press, I caught Catherine's eye in the audience. She gave me a subtle nod of approval that meant more to me than any applause. The Mitchell Hotel Group has always been about creating experiences that feel like home, I told the crowd. Not because we offer homey accommodations, quite the opposite, but because, like the best homes, our hotels are built on a foundation of trust, attention to detail, and genuine care for everyone who walks through our doors. I raised a glass for a toast to the future of the Mitchell legacy, built on the wisdom of the past but unafraid to embrace new possibilities. As glasses clinked throughout the room, I knew we had not just survived Richard's betrayal, we had emerged stronger, wiser, and more united than ever before. 1 year after Richard's arrest, the Mitchell Hotel Group had not only recovered but was expanding. We had opened a new property in Seattle, bringing our total to 13 hotels, each maintaining the distinctive character and personalized service that had been Catherine's hallmark. Richard had pleaded guilty to multiple charges of fraud and embezzlement in exchange for a reduced sentence of 8 years. Victor Hastings had eventually been located in Singapore and extradited to face similar charges. The financial investigation had recovered most of the stolen funds, though some remained lost in the labyrinth of offshore accounts. More important than the business recovery was the healing that had occurred within our family. My mother had rediscovered her passion for hospitality, taking on a role as Director of Guest Experience, a position that allowed her to travel between properties, training staff in the subtle art of anticipating needs without intrusiveness. My relationship with Catherine had evolved as well. After the initial rush of reclaiming the company, we had some difficult conversations about her methods. Was it really necessary to let me suffer for so long? I asked her one evening as we shared a quiet dinner in her apartment. Couldn't you have revealed yourself sooner? Catherine considered the question carefully. Perhaps I could have. But would you be the leader you are today if I had? I might have been, I countered. Without all the trauma. Leadership isn't forged in comfort, Audrey, she said gently. It's forged in fire. You faced the worst challenge imaginable. Betrayal from those closest to you. And you didn't break. That strength will serve you for the rest of your career. I understood her perspective, even if I didn't entirely agree with it. Catherine came from a different generation, one that believed in hard lessons and baptisms by fire. Her methods had been extreme, but her intentions, to prepare me for the realities of business leadership, had been genuine. The most remarkable transformation had been in my mother. Free from Richard's manipulation and reconnected to the family business, she had bloomed. The bitterness that had characterized her for years had faded, replaced by a quiet confidence and occasional flashes of the warmth I remembered from childhood. I spent so many years resenting your relationship with Catherine, she confessed during a rare heart-to-heart. After your father died, I felt like she pulled you closer and pushed me away. Richard saw that vulnerability and exploited it masterfully. He exploited all of us, I reminded her. Even Catherine. My mother nodded. The irony is that in trying to destroy this family, he ultimately forced us to rebuild it stronger than before. That rebuilding hadn't been easy. There had been heated arguments, tears, and painful revelations as we worked through decades of misunderstandings. Bradford Stevens had occasionally served as mediator, his steady presence helping us navigate the most difficult conversations. The business rebuilding had been challenging as well. Some loyal guests had been alienated by the changes Richard implemented, requiring dedicated efforts to win them back. Staff morale had suffered, with even those who kept their jobs feeling uncertain about the company's direction. I addressed these challenges directly, instituting a Back to Mitchell Basics program that re-emphasized the core values Catherine had established: impeccable service, distinctive character, and authentic connection with guests and communities. At the same time, I introduced innovations of my own: more sustainable operations, technology enhancements that improved efficiency without sacrificing personalization, and a profit-sharing program that gave every employee a stake in our success. Catherine watched these changes with approval, occasionally offering guidance, but increasingly stepping back to let me lead. True to her word, she had officially retired 6 months after Richard's arrest, though she remained available for consultation and still maintained an office at headquarters. "You've found the perfect balance," she told me after reviewing our quarterly results. "Honoring tradition while embracing necessary change. That's something your father would have struggled with, I think. He was brilliant, but sometimes resistant to new ideas." Coming from Catherine, this was the highest praise imaginable. I had spent my life trying to live up to the legacy of a father I barely remembered and a grandmother whose shadow seemed impossibly large. For the first time, I felt I was creating my own path, not just following theirs. Our family healing reached an important milestone when we gathered to celebrate the renaming of our newest property. The Seattle hotel would be called the William, after my father. The opening ceremony brought together employees from across the company, loyal guests, and local dignitaries. As I prepared to cut the ribbon, I looked at Catherine and my mother standing side by side, something that would have been unimaginable 2 years earlier. "The Mitchell Hotel Group has always been about family," I told the assembled crowd. "Not just the Mitchell family, though we're well represented here today, but the family we've created across 12, now 13, properties. The staff who remember guests' preferences year after year. The guests who bring their children and then, years later, their grandchildren to stay with us." I touched the ribbon, but didn't cut it yet. "We've weathered some storms recently, both public and private. But like any strong family, we've emerged more resilient, more united, and more committed to the values that matter." With Catherine and my mother each holding one side of the scissors, we cut the ribbon together, 3 generations of Mitchell women united in purpose. Later that evening, as we shared a celebratory dinner in the hotel's restaurant, Catherine raised her glass in a toast. "To Audrey," she said, "who proved herself worthy of the Mitchell legacy not by following in my footsteps, but by forging her own path when it mattered most." My mother added her own toast: "To second chances, in business and in family." I looked at these 2 remarkable women who had shaped me in such different ways: Catherine with her strength and vision, my mother with her resilience and newfound openness, and felt a profound gratitude for the journey we had shared, however difficult it had been. "To the Mitchell women," I said, raising my own glass. "May we always be too stubborn to give up, too smart to be fooled twice, and wise enough to forgive the past as we build the future." As our glasses clinked, I reflected on the lessons of the past 2 years. I had learned that betrayal can come from those closest to you, that appearances can be deceiving, that the strongest leadership emerges not from comfort but from crisis. But I had also learned that family bonds, though they may stretch and fray, can be repaired with patience and genuine effort. That forgiveness doesn't erase the past but creates space for a new future. And that the most valuable legacy isn't buildings or bank accounts, but the values and vision passed from one generation to the next. The Mitchell Hotel Group would continue to evolve under my leadership, facing new challenges and opportunities. But its foundation, built by Catherine, tested by adversity, and now strengthened by our renewed family bonds, would remain unshakable. What's the most shocking family betrayal you've experienced or heard about? Drop a comment below and let me know. If you enjoyed this wild journey through the Mitchell family drama, please hit that like button, subscribe to my channel for more real-life stories, and share with someone who appreciates a good comeback story. Remember, sometimes the biggest setbacks lead to the strongest comebacks. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next video.